When you picture a freeze killing an orchard, you imagine a blizzard, wind, ice on the branches, snow piling against the trunks, something loud and violent that a man can see coming and brace against. But the freeze that wipes out a valley does not look like that. It is silent, windless. The sky is perfectly clear, and that is exactly why it kills, because nothing stands between the ground and the stars, and the earth's heat bleeds upward all night through an open door that no one thinks to shut. One farmer understood the door. He could not afford to buy iron heaters or hire men, so he tried to shut it with smoke. The letter arrived on the 3rd of January, 1913, carried by a boy on a sorrel mule who did not wait for a reply. Amos Rel Whitcomb read it standing in the doorframe of a house that still smelled of fresh-cut pine and his dead wife's lye soap. The First National Bank of Grand Junction regretted to inform him that the crop insurance pool for Adobe Creek Valley had been dissolved due to insufficient enrollment. His note would be called in full, $140 sum if no harvestable fruit reached the packing shed by August. The letter was dated December 28th. It had taken 6 days to reach him because the mail route through the Upper Valley ran only twice a week, and the Christmas post had backed up behind a freight wreck near Palisade. He folded the letter into his coat pocket and looked at his orchard. 870 trees stood in rows on 32 acres of lower slope, their bark still young enough to split in a hard freeze. Peach, apple, and pear. 3 years planted, not one of them old enough to fruit heavy. He had $16 in cash, 4 barrels of low-grade coal oil bought cheap from a railroad man who owed him for a stove repair, and 9 tons of spoiled straw available from a neighbor's collapsed barn if he hauled it himself. His daughter Nettie, 12 years old, kept the orchard accounts on a school slate because paper cost money they did not have. He could not leave. The mortgage was secured by both the land and the house. If the orchard died, the bank would take everything before the snow melted. There was no family to return to in Missouri. Clara's people had sold the farm after the funeral and scattered to Kansas City. His own mother was dead. His father had been dead longer. The road out of Adobe Creek Valley led to nothing he could afford to reach. Nettie appeared in the doorway behind him, holding a biscuit she had made from the last of the flour and a tin of bacon grease. She was thin in the way children get thin when meals are planned around what is cheapest rather than what is enough. She looked at his face and did not ask about the letter. She had learned in the year since her mother died of tuberculosis in a Grand Junction boarding house that some letters were not for reading aloud. "The stove needs ash cleaned," she said. Amos took the biscuit and ate it in 3 bites. It tasted like nothing. Everything tasted like nothing since Clara. He went inside and cleaned the stove while Nettie counted kindling sticks and wrote the number on her slate. 22 sticks. Enough for 2 days if they kept the drafts closed and wore coats indoors. She asked him a question while he worked. Can peaches freeze before they are peaches? He understood what she meant. The buds. The promise of fruit locked inside bark that was too young and too thin. Not if they are watched, he said. It was the first lie he had told her since Clara died, and it sat in his chest like a stone. The sky that week was the kind of sky that frightened men who understood it. Clear, bottomless, not a thread of cloud from the Book Cliffs to the Uncompahgre. The sun rose sharp and set sharp, and in between the air felt warm enough to fool a newcomer into thinking January in western Colorado was mild. But Amos had repaired stoves for 7 years before he ever planted a tree, and he knew what a clear sky meant when the wind stopped. Heat leaves. That was what his mother had said, crouching beside a smoke-blackened brick wall in Callaway County, Missouri, holding his hand flat against the warm surface. He had been 8 or 9. She kept a kitchen garden alive through freezes that killed her neighbors' plantings, and she did it not with glass or canvas, but with stone, banked coals, and timing. She would press his palm against the brick, then move it to the cold window glass. "Feel that," she said. Cold does not only come down, heat leaves. A clear night is an open door. He had filed the lesson the way children file things, without knowing it would matter. Now it mattered. The barometer on his kitchen wall, a brass instrument he had taken in trade for repairing a dentist's parlor stove in Grand Junction, showed a reading that made no sense to most people. The pressure was falling, but there was no storm, no cloud, no wind. The needle dropped the way it drops before weather that has no name in common speech, a radiation frost, where the earth loses its heat straight up through clear air into a sky that gives nothing back. Amos tapped the glass. The needle did not rise. Judge Ephraim Cade arrived on the 5th of January, riding a gray gelding and wearing a coat that cost more than Amos's house. Cade was 64, a former cattleman who had made his money in water rights before the orchards came, and he sat on the irrigation board that controlled every ditch in the valley. He was not cruel, he was experienced, which was worse, because his certainty came from decades of watching men fail at exactly what Amos was attempting. He did not dismount. He sat his horse at the edge of the orchard and looked at the rows of young trees, the unpainted house, the single stovepipe trailing thin smoke, and the barrels of coal oil stacked against the north wall like ammunition for a war no one else was fighting. "Whitcomb," he said, "I heard about the pool." "News travels." "Bad news always does." Cade adjusted his reins. "I came to see what you have." Amos did not invite him inside. He walked him through the orchard instead, and the walk became the assessment that would define the next week of his life. Cade dismounted at the lower edge, where the slope flattened into a shallow bowl that collected irrigation runoff in summer, and Amos suspected collected cold air in winter. Cade pressed his thumb against the bark of a 3-year peach. The bark gave slightly. He shook his head. "Young wood," he said. "Thin bark. Sap already wants to move because you had those warm days last week. How many trees?" 870. "Acres?" 32. Cade looked at the coal oil. "How many barrels?" 4. "Of what grade?" "Low, railroad waste, heavy, and foul." Cade walked to the neighbor's collapsed barn, where the spoiled straw was piled in wet heaps. He kicked a clump with his boot. It fell apart, dark with mold and ice crystals. "You have young bark on low ground," Cade said. "You have maybe 4 barrels of oil that will smoke more than it burns. You have straw that is half frozen and half rotten. Your trees sit where the cold drains to. You need commercial heaters, at least 300 pots for this acreage, spaced no more than 40 feet apart. You need fuel contracts, sand wicks, and hired men to watch them through the night. The freight cost alone would run past $60, and that is before you buy a single heater." He mounted his horse and looked down at Amos the way men look at problems they have already solved in their minds. "You need money, men, and iron," Cade said. "You have none. I'm sorry about Clara. I'm sorry about the note, but sorrow does not heat an orchard." He rode out through the lower gate, and Amos stood in the ruts his horse left and felt the air change as the sun dropped behind the mesa. The temperature fell 4 degrees in 20 minutes. He felt it on the back of his neck like a hand pressing down. Nettie watched from the kitchen window. She had heard everything. She wrote on her slate, 300 pots, $60 freight, 40 feet apart. Below that she wrote, "We have $16. She did not erase it. She left it on the table where Amos would see it, because she understood at 12 that numbers were more honest than hope. The next morning, Amos did something that looked like madness to anyone watching, but felt like the only sane response to a problem that had no conventional solution. He hung 2 thermometers. The first he nailed to the post beside the kitchen pump, 4 feet above the ground, on the lower slope where his orchard sat. The second he carried up the path to the north bench above the valley and nailed it to a fence post near the schoolyard at roughly the same height. He checked them at dawn. The lower orchard read 24 degrees. The north bench, higher, more exposed to open sky, read 31. He checked them again at noon. Both read 42. He checked them at dusk. The lower orchard read 29. The north bench read 33. The numbers told him what his mother had taught him, with a brick wall and a window pane. On clear, still nights, the ground lost its heat upward through the open sky. The cold air, heavier than warm air, drained downhill and pooled in the lowest places. But above the cold pool, a layer of warmer air sat like a lid. The valley was inverting. Warm air on top, cold air on the bottom, and his orchard sitting in the coldest pocket of all. A radiation frost, the kind that killed not with wind or storm, but with silence. Clear sky, no cloud, no movement, just heat leaving the earth through an open door that nothing held shut. Amos sat on his porch that evening with the 2 temperature readings written on the back of the bank's letter and thought about what Cade had said. 300 commercial heaters, $60 freight, money, men, and iron. He had none of those things, but he had 4 barrels of coal oil, 9 tons of spoiled straw, scrap wood from the collapsed barn, a valley shaped like a bowl, and the memory of his mother's voice saying, "Heat leaves." The idea did not arrive as a flash. It arrived as a question. If heat leaves upward through clear sky, and cold air pools in the low places, and warm air sits above it like a lid, what happens if you put heat back into the low places? Not with 300 iron pots and hired crews and fuel contracts, with whatever you have. Straw, oil, brush, scrap, dung, anything that burns slow and puts warmth into the air where the cold settles. The smoke would not be the protection. Amos understood that already, though he could not have said it in the language of a scientist. Smoke was visible. Smoke was dramatic. Smoke was what people would see and talk about. But the thing that mattered was heat. Hundreds of small, ugly, temporary combustion points releasing warmth into the trapped air of the inversion, stirring the cold pool, raising the temperature in the lowest places just enough to keep young bark from splitting and buds from dying. The smoke would show him where the air moved. It would rise until it hit the warm lid of the inversion, then spread flat. Where it spread, the inversion held. Where it rose and kept rising, the lid had broken. Smoke was not the weapon. Smoke was the map. He sketched the plan on the back of a flour sack with a carpenter's pencil. 120 damp straw heaps, each waist-high mixed with brush and prunings from the orchard rows. 40 lard pail burners, 5-quart pails scavenged from the store's waste pile, filled with sand, soaked with coal oil, fitted with rag wicks and punched lids to control draft. Fire lines cut along the irrigation ditches where cold air pooled deepest. An ignition order based on drainage, lower hollows first, orchard rows second, town edge last. Thermometer stations at 4 points to track the temperature. A bell signal, 1 ring to prepare, 3 rings to light. The plan was ugly. It was dangerous. It relied on physics that Amos understood through instinct and inherited knowledge rather than education. It required more labor than one man could provide. And it assumed that the inversion would hold, that the smoke would behave, that the wind would stay calm, and that not a single heap or pail would throw sparks into a barn or a dry shake roof. But the alternative was to sit in a house that smelled of lye soap and wait for the frost to take everything. Marantavite came by on the afternoon of the 6th, leading a mule loaded with fence wire she had bought in town. She was 31, Norwegian-born, with hands that had been cracked by work since she was old enough to carry water. She ran 20 acres of apple and pear on the next parcel south, and she did it alone because her husband had died of a burst appendix in 1911 and she had refused every offer to sell. She saw the flour sack map spread on Amos's porch rail and stopped. "What is this?" Amos told her. Marin set down her wire and studied the map. She traced the ditch lines with her finger. She looked at the heaps of straw already piled at the lower edge of the orchard. She looked at the pails, crude, ugly, punched with uneven holes. If smoke made heat, she said, every chimney would save its own roof. What are you truly counting on? It was the best question anyone had asked him, and Amos answered it not with words, but with a demonstration. He took 2 shallow pans from the kitchen, tin plates, battered, and set them on the porch rail. In one he put dry kindling and lit it. The flame leaped high and hot. He held his hand a foot above it and felt the heat strong and immediate. In 60 seconds, the kindling was ash. In the second pan, he packed damp straw, a fistful of oily rags, and a knob of coal. He lit it. The straw caught slow. Smoke poured up thick and acrid. The heat was lower, spread wider, and lasted. After 2 minutes, the first pan was cold. The second still radiated warmth through a haze that hung in the still evening air and did not rise. Marin watched the smoke flatten against the invisible ceiling of warmer air above them. "Then smoke is not the horse," she said. "It is the tracks." "The heat is the horse," Amos said. "The smoke tells me where the horse is going." Marin said nothing for a long time. She looked at the straw heaps, the pails, the flour sack map, and the 2 thermometers hanging at different heights on opposite sides of the valley. "I still think half of this is foolish," she said. "But I know what cold air does in a hollow. My apple rows sit in one." She picked up her wire and led her mule home. She did not say she would help. She did not say she believed. But she did not say he was wrong, and in Adobe Creek Valley in January of 1913, that was as close to an ally as Amos Whitcomb had. The trouble came from the freight platform, as trouble in small towns often does. Lyman Voss owned the general store, brokered freight for the valley, and held quiet interests in 3 farm notes besides Amos's. He was 46, clean-shaven, and he wore a vest even in winter because it made him look like a man who did not need to work with his hands. He had already offered to take Amos's orchard for half the mortgage value, a deal that would leave Amos homeless and Voss owning 32 acres near the planned irrigation spur that would triple the land's worth inside 5 years. On the morning of January 7th, Voss stood on the freight platform and watched Amos load cracked lard pails, rag bundles, lamp wicks, and 2 barrels of coal oil waste onto a borrowed wagon. The oil smelled like something dead. The rags looked like something burned. The pails looked like something thrown away. Voss laughed, not quietly, not behind his hand. He laughed the way men laugh when they want everyone on the platform to hear. "He means to save peaches by poisoning children," Voss said. The line stuck. It was the kind of line that sticks because it sounds clever and carries just enough truth to make people uncomfortable. Within hours, it had reached the church, the schoolhouse, and the 3 farms closest to Amos's lower boundary. Mothers began to worry. The school teacher, a woman named Dills, who had already lost 1 student to winter croup, asked the deacon whether Amos could be restrained from lighting fires near the schoolyard. The deacon, a cautious man who feared lawsuits more than frost, told Amos directly that smoke settling over the schoolhouse would be treated as a public danger. Cade sent word through his hired man, if any barn caught fire from Amos's experiments, Cade would hold him personally responsible and see him jailed. And Voss worked quieter and sharper than any of them. He found 2 boys who had been helping Amos cut brush and paid them each $1 to stay home. He spread the idea carefully at the store counter and the feedlot that Amos had not been right since Clara died. That grief had made him reckless, that a man who would burn oil and straw near homes where children slept was a man whose judgment had broken. Amos heard it all. He heard it from Nettie, who heard it at school. He heard it from the mail boy who repeated Voss's line with a grin because he was 14 and did not understand what it meant. He heard it in the silence of men who had nodded to him last week and now looked away. He stood in Voss's store on the afternoon of the 7th and asked for 20 more pails on credit. His voice was level. His hands were at his sides. He did not defend himself. He did not explain the plan. He asked for pails. Voss did not answer immediately. He served 2 women buying salt and thread. He weighed a pound of coffee for the barber. He let Amos stand at the counter while customers came and went, each one glancing at the man who meant to save peaches by poisoning children. It was a performance, and Voss performed it with the patience of a man who understood that silence humiliates more efficiently than words. When the store was empty, Voss leaned against the counter and folded his arms. "You know what I think about, Whitcomb? I think about your girl, 12 years old, no mother, a father who spends his last dollars on lamp oil and rotten straw." He shook his head, and the gesture carried more violence than a fist. "You want pails. I want to know who feeds Nettie when you have burned through your oil and your trees are still dead." "The trees will not die," Amos said. "Every man who has lost a crop said that the week before he lost it." Voss opened his ledger and ran his finger down a column. "I have your note here. $140, due in August. You understand what happens if the bank calls it and you cannot pay." "I understand." "I offered you $70 for the parcel, clean sale, enough to move you and Nettie somewhere warm. That offer stands tonight. It will not stand next week." Amos looked at the ledger, at the column of figures that represented his life, reduced to arithmetic. He looked at the pails stacked behind the counter. Good tin, unpunched, 20 cents each. "I'm asking for pails," he said, "not advice." "Bring a deed," Voss said, "and I will talk." Amos left without the pails. The bell above the door rang behind him like a period at the end of a sentence. Tell us in the comments, have you ever been doubted by someone who did not understand what you were building? He was 50 yards down the road when Marin's mule appeared, loaded with 20 lard pails and a coil of baling wire. She had bought them herself, with money she could not spare, from a tinker's wagon that had stopped at her gate that morning. "I still think half of this is foolish," she said again. It was becoming a ritual between them, her doubt paired with her help, as if she could not bring herself to believe, but could not bring herself to stand aside. She made him carry the pails himself. "I am not your crew," she said. "I am your neighbor who thinks cold air in a hollow kills apple trees, and I would rather waste $10 on pails than lose 10 years of planting." Amos carried the pails to his orchard. His shoulders ached. His right hand had a blister from the wire handle that he could feel opening and closing with each step. He set them in a row beside the others and looked at what he had. 43 pails. Not enough. 120 straw heaps plotted on the flour sack map. 41 built. Not enough. 4 barrels of oil. Maybe enough if nothing spilled, nothing flared, and every wick caught on the first match. The barometer on the kitchen wall read lower than it had read the day before. The sky was still clear, still bottomless, still not a thread of cloud from the Bookcliffs to the Uncompare. Nettie updated her slate. 43 pails, 41 heaps, $16 minus 4 for wicks and sand, $12 left. She looked at the numbers and looked at her father and said nothing, because the numbers said everything. Construction began in earnest on the morning of January 8th, and it began with the thing Amos feared most, asking for help he could not repay. He walked the valley that morning, not on the road, but through the orchards, the ditch lines, the back paths between farms. He knocked on 6 doors. At 4 of them, he was turned away, politely at 2, silently at 1, and with Voss's line quoted back at him at the 4th. At the 5th, a widow named Mrs. Inez Bell, the deputy's wife, Bess, listened while he explained the plan with the flour sack map spread on her kitchen table. She had 3 apple saplings planted the previous spring that showed hairline cracks in their bark from a frost the week before Christmas. She did not say she believed him. She said, "I believe in trying before burying." She gave him torn sheets for wicks, a bag of clean sand for pail ballast, and the use of her son for 2 afternoons. The son was 15, strong enough to swing an axe, and quiet in the way boys are quiet when they have decided to do something without understanding why. At the 6th door, an old man named Prewitt gave him scrap lumber from a dismantled chicken coop and asked only that Amos return the nails. It was not much, but it was material, and material was the difference between a plan and a map. Amos began building in the lower hollow, where the irrigation ditch curved and the cold air pooled thickest. He worked on his knees in frozen mud, setting straw heaps at intervals of roughly 40 feet, wider than commercial heaters would require, but he did not have commercial heaters. Each heap was waist high, a mix of spoiled straw, orchard brush, and scrap wood, with a core of coal oil-soaked rags that would catch fast when lit. The straw had to be packed tight enough to hold its shape, but loose enough to draw air. Too tight, and it would smolder without heat. Too loose, and a gust would scatter it before he could light it. Between the heaps, at every 3rd interval, he placed a lard pail burner. Sand in the bottom, 2 inches packed firm to keep the pail from tipping and to absorb heat that would radiate after the oil burned down. Coal oil pooled above the sand. Rag wicks threaded through punched holes in the lid. The lid controlled the draft. Too many holes, and the oil would flare and burn out in minutes. Too few, and the wick would smother. Mrs. Bell's son, a boy named Wesley, who had his mother's jaw and his father's silence, hauled brush from the collapsed barn with a handcart. He did not ask questions. He piled brush where Amos pointed, cut lengths of orchard pruning with a hatchet, and dragged straw bales through frozen ruts until his boots were black with mud and ice. At noon, Amos gave him a cold biscuit and a cup of water from the pump. The boy ate standing up, the way men eat when they are working, and went back to the brush pile without being told. By mid-afternoon, Amos had placed 23 heaps in the lower hollow and along the first ditch line. His back ached from bending. His knees were raw through his trousers. The coal oil had soaked into the skin of his hands until they cracked and stung in the cold air, and no amount of washing in the ditch could get the smell out. He learned this the hard way. The 3rd pail he lit on the first afternoon flared sideways through a crack in the tin, threw a tongue of flame across his right sleeve, and left a burn that ran from his wrist to his elbow. He plunged his arm in the irrigation ditch and stood there, shaking while cold water ran over skin that felt like it was still on fire. Nettie saw. She ran to him with a cloth and wrapped the burn without speaking. Her hands were steady. Her face was not. "You cannot finish if you burn," she said. It was the most adult thing she had ever said to him, and it stopped him cold. He sat on the ditch bank and looked at 43 pails and 41 heaps, and a valley full of trees that needed 3 times as many of both. And he felt the doubt that mirrored Cade's verdict rise up in his chest like water filling a well. Not enough. Not enough time. Not enough material. Not enough hands. Not enough knowledge. A stove repairman from Missouri pretending he could fight a freeze with garbage and guesswork. The burn on his arm throbbed. The barometer at home, he knew without looking, was still falling. The sky was still clear. He picked up the next pail and punched the lid holes smaller. 2 fewer holes on the windward side, 1 more on the lee. The flame, when he lit it, burned steady, blue at the base, orange at the lip. It did not flare. It did not smother. It burned the way a stove burns when the draft is right, and Amos knew drafts the way a carpenter knows grain because he had spent 7 years inside other people's houses making broken stoves obey. He built 9 more pails before dark, each one steadier than the last. each one an argument against the doubt in his chest. He cut fire breaks along the irrigation ditches with a mattock, scraping frozen soil back from the straw heaps so a spark could not jump from one to the ditch bank. The mattock rang against frozen ground like a bell with a cracked tongue. Every third stroke jarred the burn on his arm and sent a white flash up to his shoulder. He kept swinging. By the end of the day, the lower hollow had 23 heaps and 9 pails in place. The second ditch line had 18 heaps stacked, but not yet fitted with oil cores. The orchard rows between them were untouched. The town edge, the last zone in his ignition plan, had nothing at all. He had used 1¼ barrels of coal oil. 3 remained. Each pail needed a cup of oil to fill. Each straw heap needed a fistful of oil-soaked rags at its core. He did the arithmetic while washing his hands in the pump trough, and the numbers tasted like the iron in the water. 40 pails would take 10 gallons. 120 heaps would take another 8. He had roughly 25 gallons left across 3 barrels. It would be close. It would be exactly the kind of close that meant a single spilled barrel could end everything. The sun went down at 4:47. By 5:15, the temperature at his kitchen pump read 26 degrees. On the north bench, the schoolyard thermometer read 32. The inversion was holding. The valley was cooling from the bottom up, cold air pooling in the bowl, while warm air sat above like a hand pressed flat over a grave. Nettie stood on the porch and looked at the sky. No cloud, no wind. Stars coming out one by one, sharp as nail heads. "How cold will it get?" she asked. Amos looked at the barometer. He looked at the thermometer. He looked at the clear sky that was bleeding heat from the ground like an open wound. "Cold enough to matter," he said. She went inside. He heard her writing on the slate, the scratch of chalk counting what they had against what they needed. 43 pails built, 40 planned, 79 heaps of 120 stacked, $12 cash, 4 days until the next temperature reading from the weather office in Grand Junction, and a sky that had not produced a single cloud in 9 days. The numbers were not enough. They were never going to be enough. But the alternative was Voss standing on the freight platform in August, holding a deed to 32 acres of dead trees and smiling with teeth that had never bitten into anything harder than profit. Amos went back to the lower hollow. He worked by lantern light until his burned arm seized and his back locked. He built 4 more heaps. He punched 6 more lids. He carried oil until his coat stank and his eyes watered. At 10 o'clock he stopped. The temperature at the pump read 23. The straw heaps stood in the dark like cairns marking a road no one else could see. The pails sat in their rows with punched lids that caught the lantern light and threw it back in small, uneven stars. Somewhere on the north bench, a dog barked once and stopped, as if the air were too hard and too still to carry the sound. Amos went inside. Nettie was asleep with the slate on her chest, the chalk still in her hand. He covered her with the quilt Clara had sewn the winter before she died, the one with the starburst pattern that Nettie refused to use because she said it still smelled like her mother, and he sat by the stove and watched the fire through the draft holes and thought about heat and smoke and the difference between the two, and whether a man could hold back a frost with nothing but the things other men had thrown away. The barometer needle sat where it had sat all day, low, still, waiting. Outside, the sky was clear to the edge of the earth, and the stars burned the way stars burn when nothing stands between them and the ground, brilliant and cold and absolutely silent. The wagon appeared on the morning of January 9th, coming up the lower road from the direction of the railroad siding. It was pulled by a single horse that coughed with every 4th step, and it carried a load of scrap stovepipe, tin sheeting, and a wooden crate of tools that rattled like bones in a drum. The man driving it was 59 years old, German-born, with hands so scarred from metalwork that the skin on his knuckles looked like cracked harness leather. His name was Elias Bruck. He stopped the wagon at the edge of Amos's orchard and sat looking at the straw heaps and the lard pail burners for a long time without speaking. Then he climbed down, walked to the nearest pail, and picked it up. He turned it over. He looked at the punched holes in the lid, the sand bed inside, the oil stain on the tin. He ran his thumb across the draft holes, counting them, measuring their spacing by touch. "Who punched these?" he asked. "I did," Amos said. Elias set the pail down and picked up another. This one had the holes punched unevenly, 3 on one side, 5 on the other, the pattern of a man learning by testing rather than following a diagram. "You are adjusting as you go," Elias said. It was not a question. "The first one's flared. I closed the draft." Elias nodded. He looked at Amos's burned arm, wrapped in a strip of cotton sheeting that was already dirty. He looked at the straw heaps in the lower hollow. He looked at the flour sack map pinned to the porch rail with 2 bent nails. "I repaired oil burners near Grand Junction for 3 years," he said. "Before that, I was a boilerman on the Denver and Rio Grande. I know what happens when oil burns wrong." He set the pail down. "I also know what happens when it burns right." Amos waited. "Your holes are too large on the windward side," Elias said. "A gust will push the flames sideways and melt the seam. You need smaller holes there and a baffle, a strip of tin bent inward to break the draft before it hits the wick." He pulled a pair of pliers from his coat pocket as if they lived there. "May I?" Amos handed him a pail. In 40 seconds, Elias bent a half-inch strip of tin inward on the windward row of holes, creating a lip that deflected incoming air downward before it reached the flame. He lit the wick with a match from his vest. The flame went blue at the base and held steady even when Elias blew across the top. "Too much air makes a fast fire that burns out before dawn," Elias said. "Too little air smothers the wick, and you lose the pail. The fire must be obedient." He adjusted the tin strip by a fraction of an inch. The flame widened slightly, the orange climbing higher but not flickering. A proud fire becomes a funeral. It was the kind of knowledge that could not be learned from a book or guessed from first principles. It was the knowledge of a man who had watched metal and flame argue with each other for 30 years and had learned to referee. "Why are you here?" Amos asked. Elias looked at the valley, at the clear sky, at the barometer visible through the kitchen window. "Because I heard a fool was building fire pits in a hollow," he said. "And the last time I heard that, the fool was right, and the hollow was an orchard outside Grand Junction, and the man who built the pit saved 1,100 trees with oil burners he made from lard cans and prayer." He paused. "That man was not me, but I fixed his burners when they cracked, and I watched his method work when men with better equipment failed because they set their heaters on high ground where the cold was not." He pointed to Amos's lower hollow. "You put your heaps where the cold pools, not where the ground is flat or the walking is easy. That is not a guess. That is someone who understands drainage." Amos said nothing, but something shifted in his chest, the weight of the doubt moving aside, not gone, but making room for something else. Elias stayed. He stayed, and he changed everything, not the plan. The plan was sound, but the execution, the difference between a system that might work and a system that would hold through a killing night, that was what Elias brought. On the first afternoon, he taught Amos draft control. They sat on upturned buckets in the orchard with 6 pails between them, each one punched differently, and Elias lit them one at a time. He made Amos hold his hand above each flame and describe what he felt. Fast heat that stung and faded, slow heat that pushed steady and warm, uneven heat that came in pulses like breathing. Each pattern told a story about what the air was doing inside the pail, and Elias translated. "This one breathes too fast," he said, pointing to a pail with wide holes. "It will drink its oil in 2 hours. You need 6. He crimped 2 holes shut with his pliers. The flame slowed. The heat steadied. "Now it will last. Not pretty, but lasting is what matters when the cold comes at midnight and does not leave until dawn." On the second day, Elias taught heat placement. They walked the ditch lines at dawn before the sun warmed the air, and Elias showed Amos how to find cold pools with his body instead of a thermometer. He crouched low and held his face near the ground. He moved 10 paces and crouched again. "Here," he said. "Feel it. The air's colder at your ankles than at your chest. The cold has settled. This is where a heap belongs." He moved upslope 20 feet. "Here the air moves. Warmer. Not much, but enough. A heap here wastes fuel because the cold is not waiting for it." Amos felt it. The difference was subtle, a degree, maybe 2, but it was real. The cold pooled in the low places the way water pooled after rain. It followed the same paths, the same channels, the same logic of gravity. And the straw heaps belonged not where a man would choose to build them for convenience, but where the cold chose to gather. They repositioned 11 heaps that morning, moving them downslope by 10 or 20 feet, into the wet, uncomfortable places where the ditch mud sucked at boots and the straw got damp. Amos's back ached, his burned arm throbbed under its wrapping, but every heap they moved was a correction, a step from guessing toward knowing. On the third day, Elias taught fire discipline. He laid out the rules that would keep the system from becoming a catastrophe. Wet burlap at every 4th heap, draped over a fence post, ready to smother a flare. Sand buckets at every pail station. 2 scoops could kill an oil fire that water would spread. Ditch breaks scraped clean of straw and brush for 8 feet on both sides, so a spark could not jump from heap to ditch, bank to barn. And the cardinal rule, repeated until Amos heard it in his sleep: never light into the wind. Always light from the downwind side, so the flame crawls toward the fuel instead of being pushed across it. "A frost fire must be obedient," Elias said again. He said it the way a man says a prayer, not because the words were beautiful, but because the alternative was something he had seen and could not forget. Amos asked what he had seen. Elias told him. An orchard outside Palisade, 2 years before. A grower lit 40 brush piles in a straight line with the wind behind him. The fire ran the line in 9 minutes. 3 acres of pruning wood, 2 tool sheds, and a mule that could not break its halter. The grower survived. The orchard did not. He understood heat, Elias said. He did not understand fire. They are not the same animal. Progress came in numbers that Nettie tracked on her slate. Day 1 with Elias. 12 new pails built with baffled draft holes. 37 heaps repositioned or rebuilt in the lower hollow and first ditch line. Total pails, 55. Total heaps, 79. Day 2. Marin arrived with her 3 oldest neighbor boys, 14, 15, and 16, and set them to cutting brush without explaining why she had changed her mind. She had not changed her mind. She had walked her own orchard at dawn, crouched in the hollow the way Elias taught, and felt the cold pool where her best apple rows stood. She did not say this to Amos. She said, "My boys need work, and your brush needs cutting. Do not read into it." The boys cut brush until their hands bled and their hatchets dulled. Marin sharpened the hatchets herself on a whetstone she carried in her coat. By evening, 22 new heaps stood along the second ditch line. Total heaps, 101. Day 3. Cade returned. He rode his gray gelding to the edge of the orchard and sat watching Amos and Elias work. He did not dismount. He counted pails, counted heaps, and looked at the fire breaks scraped along the ditches. "You have an engineer now," Cade said, meaning Elias. "I have a tinsmith," Amos said. "Same difference in this valley." Cade looked at the straw heaps, then at the schoolyard visible on the bench above. "If your smoke reaches that school, I will have Deputy Bell shut you down before sunrise. I do not care if every tree in this valley dies. Children come first." "The smoke will not reach the school," Amos said. "You do not know that." "The smoke will not rise to the school because the inversion holds it down. That is why the plan works. Cold air sits below. Warm air sits above. Smoke follows the warm air and spreads flat. It will not climb the bench." Cade stared at him. It was the first time Amos had spoken with authority rather than desperation, and the change unsettled Cade in a way that the straw heaps and oil pails had not. A desperate man can be pitied. A certain man must be reckoned with. "If you are wrong," Cade said, "I will see you in front of the magistrate." "If I am wrong," Amos said, "I will have bigger problems than the magistrate." Cade rode away without replying. Day 4. Nettie developed a cough. Not the deep, wet cough that had eaten Clara from the inside out. Amos checked, pressing his ear to her chest the way the Grand Junction doctor had shown him, listening for the rattle that meant fluid. He heard nothing but a dry, tight bark that came from cold air and thin walls in a house heated by a single stove that could not warm the far bedroom. But the cough made the smoke risk personal in a way that Voss's line about poisoning children had not. Every heap Amos stacked, every pail he filled with coal oil, every wick he threaded through a punched lid, each one would put smoke into the air his daughter breathed. He told Elias. Elias said, "Wet cloth over the nose and mouth. Seal the door with rags. Keep her inside and keep the windows shut. The smoke will not last longer than a night. The cold will last until spring." He paused. "You are not choosing between smoke and clean air. You are choosing between smoke and no home." Nettie heard them talking through the kitchen wall. She wrote on her slate and held it up at dinner. "I can breathe through a cloth. Can Peaches?" Amos did not know whether to laugh or weep. He did neither. He ate his beans and went back to work. Day 5. The barometer fell again. The weather office in Grand Junction sent no warning because the sky was clear and there was no storm to warn about. Radiation frost did not arrive on the back of a blizzard. It arrived on the back of nothing, an absence of cloud, an absence of wind, an absence of anything between the ground and the stars that might hold the heat down. Amos had 76 heaps in place. He needed 120. He had 55 pails. He needed 40. The pails were ahead of schedule. The heaps were not. Elias worked beside him until dark, and in the lantern light afterward, they built 18 more heaps along the orchard rows. Elias's hands bled from handling frozen straw. Amos's burn cracked open under its wrapping and left a streak of red on every pail he touched. At midnight, they stopped. 94 heaps, 26 short. 2 days left, maybe 3, before the barometer's promise became the valley's reality. Amos looked at the sky. Clear, silent, stars like points of ice driven into black iron. "Will it hold?" he asked. Elias looked at the barometer through the window. "The pressure is still falling. When it stops falling, the freeze is here." He rubbed his bleeding hands together. "We have until it stops." On the 6th of January, the system was completed. Not beautifully, not confidently. Completed in the way that a man finishes a wall before a flood, knowing it is imperfect, but Knowing the joints are weak, knowing that the water will find every gap, but also knowing that an imperfect wall is infinitely better than no wall at all. 109 heaps, not 120. Amos had run out of straw before he ran out of ground. 11 gaps remained in the town edge zone, where the plan called for heaps along the road between the lower orchards and the first houses. He filled 7 of the gaps with brush piles, drier, faster burning, less sustained heat, and left 4 empty because there was nothing left to burn. 58 pails stood in their positions along the ditch lines and orchard rows, each one baffled, sanded, oiled, and wicked. Each one with a lid that Elias had checked by hand, bending tin where the draft was wrong, crimping seams where oil might leak. Fire breaks ran along every ditch. Wet burlap hung on fence posts every 4th station. Sand buckets sat beside every pail. The ignition order was marked on the flour sack map in Nettie's handwriting. Lower hollows first, ditch line second, orchard rows third, town edge last. 4 thermometer stations: Amos's porch, the schoolyard, the church steps, and the north bench. A bell signal, 1 ring to prepare, 3 rings to light. It was not beautiful. It was a ragged grid of pails, straw heaps, ditch breaks, oil tins, and signal lanterns laid out across a valley that smelled of coal oil and desperation. But it was a system. It had logic. It had placement based on cold air drainage, not convenience. And it had been built by a stove repairman, a tinsmith, a Norwegian widow, a deputy's wife, 3 boys with hatchets, and a 12-year-old girl with a school slate. At 9 in the evening, Amos checked the thermometers. The schoolyard read 28. His lower orchard read 26. The north bench read 31. The church steps read 29. There was almost no wind. Smoke from a test heap rose 10 feet, then spread flat and held, visible proof that the inversion was in place. Warm air above, cold air below. The valley sealed like a jar with a loose lid. Maren stood beside Amos and watched the smoke flatten. "The valley is shaped like a bowl," she said quietly, as if admitting something she had known for a long time but had not wanted to say aloud. Elias nodded. "Bowls hold soup," he said. "They also hold cold." Cade rode past without stopping. He looked at the straw heaps and the pails and the fire breaks and said nothing, which was its own kind of verdict, not approval, but the absence of further objection. Voss did not ride past. Voss sent a complaint. He wrote it on store letterhead and sent it by the mail boy to Deputy Asa Bell, claiming that Amos Whitcomb was storing illegal quantities of coal oil near inhabited dwellings and intended to light open fires without the consent of the town. He asked that Bell intervene before someone was killed. The deputy read the letter and folded it into his coat pocket. He had been married to Inez Bell for 18 years. Inez had already given Amos torn sheets for wicks. The deputy said nothing to Voss. He said nothing to Amos. He went home and checked the crack in his own apple saplings and said nothing to anyone. The first alarm came not from the sky but from water. At 11:45, the shallow stock trough behind the feed shed skinned over with ice. Not a thick sheet, a film, a membrane, a promise. But ice that formed before midnight meant temperatures were falling faster than the valley had seen since the Christmas frost, and the Christmas frost had split bark on every young tree in the hollow. Amos touched the ice with his finger. It broke. Underneath, the water was so cold it stung. He looked at the thermometer on his porch, 24 degrees and falling. He looked at the sky, not a cloud, not a breath of wind. The stars burned like something terrible and patient. He rang the bell once. The crisis began at 1:15 in the morning on the 7th of January, 1913, when the thermometer at Amos's pump read 23 degrees and the needle was still dropping. The silence was the worst part. There was no wind, no snow, no storm to fight against or blame, just air losing its heat through a sky that gave nothing back, and a valley cooling from the bottom like a pot taken off a stove and set on cold stone. Amos stood on his porch and felt it, not heard it, not saw it. Felt it, the temperature pressing against his face like a hand made of something heavier than air. His breath came out in clouds that did not rise. They drifted flat, shoulder height, and hung there. The inversion was tight. The lid was sealed. Everything below it was going to get colder until something changed. He looked at the straw heaps in the lower hollow, dark shapes against darker ground. He looked at the pails, their lids catching faint starlight. He looked at Elias, who stood beside the ditch line with a lantern and a box of matches, and hands wrapped in cotton strips because his knuckles had cracked open from the cold and the work. Nettie was inside. Marin had come at midnight and taken the girl into the back bedroom, stuffed wet cloth under the door and around the window frame, and told Amos that his daughter was her responsibility until dawn. Amos had not argued. There was no time to argue, and Marin's face had the look of a woman who would not be moved by words. At 1:15, the thermometer touched 22. Amos rang the bell 3 times. The sound carried across the valley in the still air like something dropped into deep water. 3 clear, hard notes that reached the church, the schoolyard, the feedlot, and the first houses on the lower road. It reached Marin inside the house. It reached Wesley Bell at his mother's gate, where he stood with a lantern because his mother had told him to wait. It reached Cade, who sat up in bed and listened. It reached Voss, who turned over and pulled the quilt higher. And then the valley began to burn, the lower hollows lit first. Amos moved along the ditch line with a kerosene-soaked rag on a stick, touching the core of each straw heap. The heaps caught slow, not the explosive burst of dry kindling, but the deep, reluctant ignition of damp straw and oily rags finding their heat. Smoke poured upward in columns that rose 10 feet, 15 feet, and then stopped, spreading flat against the invisible ceiling of warm air. Within minutes, the lower hollow was a landscape from a fever dream. Orange light flickered at ground level. Smoke crawled between the tree rows like something alive, something heavy and deliberate, filling the spaces between heaps and rolling along the ditch line in a slow tide. The smell was choking: coal oil, burning straw, scorched earth, and the acrid bite of green brush thrown on hot embers. Elias lit the pails along the first ditch line. Each one flared, steadied, and settled into the blue and orange rhythm he had calibrated with his pliers and his 30 years of metal and flame. The pails put out less smoke than the heaps, but more sustained heat, a steady push of warm air into the cold pool at their feet. Wesley Bell and 2 neighbor boys lit the second ditch line. They worked fast and silent, moving from heap to heap with rags on sticks, and behind them the line of fire grew until the lower valley glowed under a ceiling of smoke that reflected the orange light back down and made the world look like the inside of a furnace seen through dirty glass. Complication came at 1:35, and it came from the wrong end of the valley. A boy, 14, the son of the feedlot owner, lit a heap near the livery shed on the town edge before the ignition order reached that zone. He lit it from the windward side, against every rule Elias had taught, and the heap flared sideways. Burning straw scattered across 6 feet of frozen ground toward the shed's wooden wall. Elias ran. He covered 40 yards in the dark, and the smoke grabbed a wet burlap from the nearest fence post and threw himself onto the scattered fire. The burlap smothered the main flame, but the edges had already caught the shed siding. Elias ripped the burning board free with his bare hands, threw it into the ditch, and stamped out the embers on the ground with his boots. His hands were burned, not badly, not the deep blistering burn that Amos carried on his arm, but the skin across both palms was red and weeping, and his left thumb had a blister the size of a nickel that he did not notice until he tried to grip his pliers and could not close his fist. He wrapped his hands in the burlap and kept moving. At 2 in the morning, the thermometer at Amos's pump read 20 degrees. The smoke had thickened until a man could not see the end of a 30-foot orchard row. Horses in the feed lot stamped and rolled their eyes. A dog somewhere on the bench barked without stopping, a high, frantic sound that cut through the smoke like a blade. Women came to their porches with wet cloths pressed to their faces and looked at a valley that seemed to be on fire from one end to the other. Cade arrived on foot, his coat pulled over his nightshirt, his boots unlaced. He found Amos at the porch thermometer station and shouted through the smoke. "You have lost control," Cade said. "I have not," Amos said. He pointed at the smoke. "Watch it. It is not rising. It spreads flat. The inversion holds it. If I had lost control, the smoke would climb, and you would see flame, not haze." Cade looked. The smoke moved like water filling a basin, slow, lateral, level. It did not climb. It did not swirl. It crawled along the ground and spread outward, and above it, 10 feet up, the air was clearer, and above that, the stars still burned. "The temperature," Amos said. He pointed at the thermometer, 20 degrees. He pointed at the porch thermometer from last week's readings, still marked on the post in pencil. 4 degrees warmer than it should be at this hour. The heaps are working." Cade said nothing. He stood in the smoke with his coat over his nightshirt and watched the thermometer and did not leave. At 2:30, the second complication arrived. Deputy Bell walked up the road with Voss behind him, and Voss carried his letter of complaint folded in his hand like a weapon. Bell was in uniform, coat, badge, and the expression of a man who had been pulled from sleep to do something he did not want to do. "Whitcomb," Bell said, "Lyman has filed a complaint. He says you are burning illegal fuel near homes without town consent." "I am burning legal fuel on my own land to protect my crop," Amos said. "The ditch line is the property boundary. Every heap inside that line is mine." "And the ones outside it?" Voss asked. His voice was tight with something worse than anger, the calculation of a man who sees an opportunity in another man's crisis. "The town edge heaps are on common ground. You have no right." "The town edge heaps protect your store," Amos said. "If the cold takes the orchards, it takes the town. No fruit, no freight, no freight, no store." Voss opened his mouth and closed it. The arithmetic of that sentence was too simple to argue with and too public to deny, because Cade was standing 3 feet away with smoke in his beard and the look of a man who had just heard something he could not unhear. Bell looked at the thermometer, 20 degrees. He looked at the smoke lying flat against the inversion. He looked at his wife's apple saplings visible beyond the ditch, their bark wrapped in cloth strips that Inez had soaked in warm water before bed. "I'm going to stand here and observe," Bell said. He folded the complaint into his coat pocket without opening it. "If I see a safety violation, I will act. Otherwise, I will observe." Voss said, "This is not—" "I said I will observe," Bell repeated. He did not look at Voss. He looked at the thermometer, and his hand rested on his coat pocket where the complaint sat folded, and he did not move. If you are invested in this story, hit subscribe and stay with us, because the next hour decides whether the valley wakes to fruit or ruin. At 3 in the morning, the darkest turn came from the north bench. The Haraway family, father, mother, infant, and a boy of 4, lived in a cabin on the exposed slope above the valley floor, in the zone where the air was warmer by natural inversion, but where no heaps or pails had been placed because the plan focused on the low ground where the cold pooled. Voss had told them 3 days earlier that Amos's plan was madness and that any sensible family would stay indoors and trust their stove. Their stovepipe cracked at 2:45. The pipe was old iron, rusted at the joint where it passed through the roof. When the pipe cracked, smoke filled the cabin instead of venting. The mother, a woman named Ruth, pulled the boy and the infant into the bedroom and stuffed blankets against the door. But the bedroom had no stove, no heat source, and the temperature inside the cabin began to fall as fast as the temperature outside. The infant, 3 months old, stopped crying. Ruth knew what that meant. An infant that stops crying in the cold is an infant whose body is shutting down. She wrapped the baby in everything she had, quilts, coats, her own shawl, and carried both children out the door into a night that read 17 degrees on the north bench. The exposed slope, the place where no heaps burned and no pails glowed, and the cold sat on the ground like iron. Maren heard the shout. She was inside Amos's house with Nettie, both of them breathing through wet cloth, when she heard Ruth Haraway screaming from the bench road. Maren went to the door, looked up the slope, and saw a woman in a nightdress carrying a bundle and pulling a child through frost that was already forming on the grass. Maren did not ask permission. She took the lantern from the porch and ran up the bench road. Deputy Bell saw her go and followed. They reached Ruth at the midpoint of the slope, where the temperature transitioned from the protected valley floor to the exposed bench, and the difference was like stepping from a room into a river. They brought the family down through the smoke to the church. The church was stone, thick walls that held the day's heat longer than wood, and 3 pails burned along its foundation. Inside, the air was warmer, not warm, but warmer. 29 degrees by the thermometer on the church steps, 12 degrees higher than the exposed bench where the Haraways had been dying by inches. The infant began to cry again inside the church. It was the most important sound anyone heard that night. Elias found Amos at the lower ditch line, adjusting a pail whose wick had begun to gutter. The oil was running low in several pails. The straw heaps along the ditch were past their peak, some already reduced to smoldering mounds that put out more smoke than heat. The system was consuming itself, burning through its fuel the way the night was burning through the valley's warmth. The Haraways nearly lost the infant, Elias said. His wrapped hands were shaking, though whether from cold, pain, or adrenaline, Amos could not tell. The bench is not protected. I know. You cannot protect the bench. You do not have fuel. You do not have heaps. I know. Elias put his hand on Amos's shoulder. The gesture was awkward. Elias was not a man who touched easily, but it carried the weight of what he had to say. Hold the low ground, Elias said. The cold wants the low ground. If you chase every acre, you will lose the acres you can save. It was the hardest lesson of the night. Not that fire could fight frost, not that smoke could trace the air, but that a man with limited fuel and limited time must choose what to save, and the choice means accepting what is lost. Amos turned back to the lower hollow. He refilled 3 pails from the last barrel of oil. He restacked a heap that had collapsed into ash. He adjusted a baffle that had warped in the heat. He did the small, technical, precise work of a stove repairman while the valley burned around him and the thermometer read 20 degrees and held. Held. At 4:15, the temperature at the pump read 21. Still cold, still dangerous. But the drop had slowed. The air in the lower valley had stabilized, not warm, but not falling. The heaps and pails were putting enough heat into the trapped inversion layer to hold the cold at bay, not to defeat it, not to push it back, but to hold it the way a man holds a door against a weight he cannot move but will not let through. On the exposed north bench, the thermometer read 17. On the valley floor, Amos's orchard read 26. The schoolyard, protected late and incompletely, read 22. The church, with stone walls and 3 pails burning at its foundation, read 29. The difference between 17 and 26 was 9 degrees. It did not sound like much, but 9 degrees was the difference between bark that held and bark that split, between buds that slept and buds that died, between a family that stayed warm enough inside a stone church and a family that nearly lost an infant in a cabin with a cracked stovepipe. 9 degrees, the width of a margin, the depth of a grave. At 5 in the morning, the smoke began to thin, not because the inversion was breaking, but because the fuel was running out. Heaps that had burned for 3 hours were now ash and ember. Pails that had glowed steady were guttering as the last oil soaked into the sand. The system was dying the way all fires die, not with a last blaze, but with a slow diminishment, a cooling that matched the cooling it had fought. Amos walked the ditch line and counted what remained. 11 pails still burning, 23 heaps still smoking. The rest were gone, spent, consumed, used up the way the night had used up everything Amos had. He stood in the lower hollow and looked east. The sky was still dark, but the quality of the dark had changed. Not lighter, not yet, but thinner, as if the black were being diluted by something gray and patient that was rising behind the book cliffs. Dawn was coming, but the cold was still there, and the fruit was still on the trees, and Amos could not tell, not by looking, not by touching, not by any sense available to a man standing in smoke and ash at 5 in the morning in January in Colorado, whether the buds were alive or dead. He looked at his hands, black with soot, cracked from cold and oil. The burn on his arm had opened again, and a thin line of blood ran to his wrist and dripped onto the frozen ground. Elias sat on an upturned bucket near the ditch, his wrapped hands in his lap, his head bowed. He was not asleep. He was resting in the way old men rest when their bodies have given everything, and the only thing left is to wait and see whether it was enough. Nettie appeared on the porch. She had come out without Maren noticing. She stood in the gray pre-dawn with a wet cloth tied over her nose and mouth and her school slate in her hand. She had been writing numbers all night, temperatures, times, pail counts, heap counts, recording the battle in chalk the way a clerk records a ledger, because numbers were the only thing she trusted more than her father. She looked at Amos across the ruined orchard, the ash, the blackened straw, the spent pails tipped on their sides, the soot on every fence rail and tree trunk. She held up the slate. It read Pump 26, School 22, Bench 17, Church 29. The numbers were the story. The valley floor had held. The bench had not. The church had held best of all. But the numbers did not answer the only question that mattered. Amos walked to the nearest peach tree. It was a 3-year tree, young bark, thin as paper. Soot coated every surface. He reached for a branch and stopped. He could not bring himself to touch it, because touching it would tell him, and knowing would be final. And as long as he did not know, the orchard was both alive and dead, and hope still lived in the space between. The gray light grew, the smoke thinned. Somewhere on the bench, a rooster crowed, a sound so ordinary and so absurd after the night's battle that Amos felt something crack inside his chest that was not a rib and not grief and not relief, but something in between all three. He stood in the ruined lower hollow and waited for the sun to touch his trees. Dawn came through soot. The sun did not rise so much as seep, gray light thickening to yellow behind a haze that turned the valley into something that looked more like the aftermath of a battle than the beginning of a morning. Every fence rail was black. Snow along the ditches had gone gray. Children came to porches with soot rings around their mouths and noses. blinking at a world that smelled like the inside of a lamp. Amos had not moved from the lower hollow. He stood beside the 3-year peach tree with his hand at his side, still unable to reach for the branch. Around him, the spent heaps smoldered in low mounds. The pails sat tipped and empty, their wicks curled and cold. The ground was warm underfoot, warmer than it should have been, warmer than the air, because the heaps had pushed heat into the frozen soil for 4 hours, and the soil was giving it back now in the way soil does, slowly, faithfully, without being asked. Myron found him there. She came through the orchard with a pocket knife in her hand and did not ask permission. She walked past Amos to the nearest peach tree, took a low branch between her thumb and forefinger, and cut it clean with a single stroke. She held the cut end up to the light. The inner tissue was green, not brown, not black, not the dead gray of frozen cambium. Green, the living color of wood that had held its moisture through a night that should have killed it. Amos took the branch from her hand. He turned it in the light. He pressed his thumbnail into the cut surface and watched the thin line of sap darken the nail. Sap that moved. Sap that had not frozen. "Check another," he said. Marin cut 10 branches from 10 different trees across the lower orchard. 8 were green. 2 showed brown edges, frost damage at the tips, where the protection was thinnest, but the core wood was alive. The buds, tucked tight against the bark, were firm and intact. Amos walked to the edge of the orchard where the lower hollow met the unprotected slope toward the bench. He cut a branch from a tree at the boundary line, the last row before the heaps ended and the open air began. Brown, dead wood. The cambium had frozen and turned the color of old leather. 1 row. The difference between a tree inside the grid and a tree 1 row outside it was the difference between alive and dead. He kept walking. He cut branches from 20 trees across the lower orchard and the first ditch line. 16 were green. 4 showed damage. None were dead. He climbed the slope to the north bench, where the Haraway's cabin sat with its cracked stovepipe still leaking thin smoke into the morning air. He cut a branch from the nearest apple tree, a 5-year tree, older and harder than his peaches, with bark thick enough to bear more cold. Brown. Deep brown. Dead to the core. The bench had lost everything. Cade arrived on foot, which meant something. A man who rode everywhere arriving on foot meant he had come in a hurry, or he had come with humility, and in Cade's case, it was both. He found Amos and Marin at the porch thermometer station, where Nettie had laid out every temperature reading from the night in 2 columns on her slate, valley floor on the left, north bench on the right. The columns told the story without a word of explanation. Valley floor, 26, 25, 24, 22, 21, 21, 22, 24. The temperature had dipped to 21 and then held, rising slightly as dawn approached. North bench, 31, 28, 24, 21, 19, 17, 17, 18. The bench had dropped to 17 and stayed there for hours. Cade looked at the numbers. He looked at the cut branches, green and brown, laid side by side on the porch rail. He looked at the soot on Amos's hands and the blood-stained wrapping on his arm and the ash in his hair. He did not say he was sorry. Men like Cade did not apologize in the way that the word implies, a bowing of the head, a softening of the voice. He apologized the way a cattleman does by stating what he now understood to be true. "I called it smoke," Cade said. "It was placement. I called it danger. It was discipline." He picked up one of the green branches and turned it in the light, examining the cut the way a man examines evidence he cannot dismiss. "I was wrong." Voss stood 10 feet away. He had arrived behind Cade, uninvited, drawn by the same gravity that pulls men toward the resolution of things they helped cause. He said nothing. His complaint was still folded in Deputy Bell's coat pocket, and Bell was standing on the church steps with his wife, both of them looking at their apple saplings, which had survived inside the grid and died outside it. "What do you need from the board?" Cade asked. Amos looked at him. It was the first time any authority in the valley had asked what Amos needed, rather than telling him what he lacked. "I need the school thermometer readings entered into the irrigation record," Amos said. "I need the board to acknowledge that cold air drainage in this valley follows the ditch lines, not the bench contours. And I need you to tell people the truth about what happened last night. Not that smoke saved the orchard, because it did not, but that heat placed where the cold settles can hold a margin." Cade nodded. "I will tell them. Tell them the bench died because nobody heated the bench, not because the method failed." Cade looked at the north slope, where the Haraways were carrying blankets back to their cabin in the gray morning light. Ruth held the infant against her chest. The child was wrapped in so many layers it looked like a bundle of laundry with a face. "The Haraways," Cade said quietly. "That was close." "That was 17 degrees on an unprotected slope," Amos said. "The valley floor held at 21. The church held at 29. The difference was placement and fuel, nothing more." Cade left. He walked back down the lower road with his hands in his coat pockets and his head forward, and he looked like a man carrying something he had not expected to carry, the weight of having been certain and wrong and publicly corrected by the man he had dismissed. They came throughout the morning, not in a rush, not in a crowd, but one family at a time, the way people come when they need something and are not sure how to ask. The first was a grower named Hendricks, who had 40 acres of apple on the south slope and had lost a quarter of his buds. He stood at the edge of Amos's orchard and looked at the spent heaps and the empty pails and the soot-covered trees that were, against every expectation, alive. "How far apart do the pails sit?" he asked. Amos told him, 40 feet for heaps, every third interval for pails. Lower in the hollows, farther apart on the slopes where cold drained through rather than pooled. "Which hollows collect cold?" "Walk your land at dawn before the sun heats the air. Crouch low. Feel the temperature at your ankles. Where it is coldest, that is where the cold has settled. How much oil per night?" "A cup per pail. More if the night runs long, less if the inversion is weak." "How many men per acre?" Amos looked at his own 32 acres, which he had covered with one tinsmith, one Norwegian widow, 3 borrowed boys, and a 12-year-old girl with a school slate. "Enough to light and enough to watch," he said. "The method does not need strength. It needs placement and patience." Hendricks left with the flour sack map copied onto a piece of butcher paper that Nettie provided. After him came the Petersons, who had 20 acres of pear, then the widow Garza, who had 6 acres of peach and no one to help her, then the school teacher Dills, who had no orchard but wanted to understand why the smoke had not risen to the schoolyard as she had feared. Amos answered every question. He showed them the pails, the baffles, the punched lids, the sand beds. He showed them the fire breaks and the wet burlap in the sand buckets. He showed them Nettie's temperature columns on the slate, valley floor, and north bench, side by side, the numbers speaking louder than any argument he could make. He did not hoard the method. He had no reason to. The method was not a secret. It was physics, heat placement, cold air drainage, fuel management, fire discipline. It belonged to anyone who could learn it, and the people who came to his porch that morning needed it the way he had needed it a week ago, with the same desperation and the same doubt. Elias helped. His burned hands were wrapped in clean cotton that Marin had torn from one of Inez Bell's donated sheets, and he could not grip his pliers, but he could talk. He sat on the porch and demonstrated draft holes with a nail punch held between his palms, showing each visitor how to punch a pattern that controlled airflow without starving the flame. He drew diagrams in the frost on the porch rail. He explained the difference between a heap that smoked and a heap that heated, and why the difference mattered more than most people knew. Marin taught the women and older children. She showed them how to read a thermometer at night without a lantern, by touch, pressing a finger to the glass and counting the distance from the bulb to where the mercury stopped. She showed them when not to light near barns. She showed them how to soak burlap so it stayed wet through a 4-hour burn and could smother a flare in 2 seconds. And Voss watched. He stood across the road near the freight platform and watched the parade of growers and farmers and wives and children walking up to Amos Whitcomb's soot-covered porch to learn the method that Voss had called madness. He did not come closer. He did not ask questions. He stood with his arms folded across his vest and his jaw set and his eyes tracking every person who crossed the road toward the man he had tried to buy out for $70. Later that afternoon, when the last visitor had gone, Voss crossed the road. He did not go to Amos. He went to the Petersons, who were loading their wagon with supplies from his store. He told them that saved fruit did not erase smoke damage, that the soot would stain the fruit, that the oil smell would taint the blossoms, that the method was a one-time gamble that would poison the soil if repeated. He offered to buy their damaged edge orchard at a discount to save them the trouble of replanting. The Petersons said no. They said it politely because Voss still held their feed account, but they said it, and Voss's jaw tightened by a fraction that only a man watching closely would have noticed. He was not finished. He was never going to be finished as long as Amos's success threatened the arithmetic of his ambition. In the weeks that followed, the relationship between Amos and Elias deepened in the way that relationships between men deepen when words are scarce and work is shared, through action, through proximity, through the silent accumulation of trust that comes from solving problems together. Elias stayed. He parked his wagon behind Amos's barn and slept in it for 2 weeks before Amos built a cot in the tool shed and told him to stop being stubborn. Elias accepted the cot the way he accepted everything, without thanks, without sentiment, with a nod that said he had weighed the offer and found it reasonable. They rebuilt the system. Not from desperation this time, but from understanding. Amos replaced the worst straw heaps with clay-lined pits, shallow depressions dug into the ditch banks, lined with river clay that Nettie found along the creek bed, packed hard and fired with brush until the clay held its shape. The pits burned cleaner than loose heaps. They contained the fire within walls. They directed heat upward instead of sideways, and they could be reloaded with fresh fuel without rebuilding from scratch. Elias built tin collars for the pails, flared rings of scrap metal that sat atop the lids, and directed heat outward while shielding the flame from gusts. Each collar was hand-cut, hand-bent, and fitted to its pail with the precision of a man who had spent his life making metal do what he told it. He worked slowly because his burned hands had stiffened, the scar tissue on his palms pulling tight when he gripped the pliers. He did not complain. He compensated, holding the tin with his wrists instead of his fingers, bracing pieces against his chest, using his teeth to hold wire while he twisted. Nettie watched him work. She had been watching since the night of the crisis when Elias had burned his hands saving the livery shed. She sat beside him on the tool shed floor one afternoon and asked if she could try. Elias looked at her hands, small, uncalloused, 12 years old. "The tin will cut you," he said. "Your hands are burned, and you still work." Elias said nothing for a moment. Then he handed her the pliers and a piece of scrap tin and showed her how to score a fold line with the edge of a nail. Nettie scored the line, bent the tin, and produced a collar that was crooked and rough and functional. Elias examined it without expression. Again, he said, straighter. She did it again and again. By the fourth collar, the fold was clean, the flare was even, and the fit was tight. Elias held it up to the light and turned it the way a jeweler turns a stone. Better than your father's, he said. It was the closest thing to praise Nettie had heard from anyone other than Amos since her mother died, and she carried it the way children carry rare things, carefully, privately, close to the chest. They worked together through February and into March. Elias taught her to solder a seam using a heated iron and a thread of tin-lead wire, melting the joint until the metal flowed into the gap and sealed it bright. She proved better at it than Amos, whose hands were too large for the fine work, and better than Elias, whose hands were too damaged. Her small fingers held the wire steady, and the solder ran where she wanted it with a patience that neither man could match. During those weeks, Elias's story came out in fragments, not confessions, not monologues, but pieces offered during the natural pauses of shared work. He had come from Saxony at 19, worked the railroads west, lost a wife to cholera in Denver, and spent 20 years repairing boilers and stovepipes and anything else that held heat and could be broken. He had no children. He had no land. He had a wagon, a horse with a cough, and a set of tools that represented his entire estate. One evening, while they sat cleaning pails by lantern light, Amos asked him why he had not settled somewhere. A settled man depends on the ground, Elias said. The ground freezes. The ground floods. The ground does what it pleases and charges you for the privilege. He polished a pail lid with a rag. A man with tools depends on breakage. Something always breaks. That is a lonely way to live. Elias looked at the lantern. The flame through the glass threw his shadow long across the barn floor. It is a free way to live, he said. Loneliness is the price. I have paid it so long I no longer notice the charge. They disagreed about the system's future. Amos wanted to expand, more heaps, more pails, coverage for the north bench and the upper slopes. Elias argued for restraint, cleaner burns, fewer heaps, better placement, less smoke. You saved the valley by filling it with smoke, Elias said. The next time, the smoke will not be forgiven. People accept a miracle once. The second time, they call it a nuisance. The second time, they will be prepared. Prepared means fewer fires, not more. Prepared means every pail burning clean and every heap placed where the cold proves it belongs. Never make more smoke than the heat requires. It was a disagreement rooted in philosophy more than technique. Amos, who had nearly lost everything, wanted to overwhelm the cold with volume. Elias, who had watched fire consume what it was meant to save, wanted precision. The tension between them was real but productive, the kind of tension that sharpens rather than separates. Maren sided with Elias, which settled it, because Maren had the social authority that neither man possessed. She told Amos plainly, "The women will not accept another night like that unless the smoke is less. Make it less, or make it not happen, because the next time Ruth Haraway carries an infant through smoke, you will have an enemy in every mother in this valley." Amos listened. He did not like it, but he listened. Elias died in late October, when the aspens along Adobe Creek had gone gold and the first hard frost was still 3 weeks away. His lungs had been failing for months, the slow, inevitable damage of decades spent breathing boiler smoke, coal dust, and the fumes of molten solder. He coughed through August. He coughed through September. By October, the cough had a sound like paper tearing, and he could not walk from the tool shed to the barn without stopping to lean against the fence and breathe in the shallow, careful way of a man whose chest will not expand. He did not stop working. He finished a final set of 14 tin collars, the last batch needed to outfit every pail in the system, and he finished them sitting down because standing made him dizzy. He cut and bent and soldered each one with the same precision he had brought to the first, and when the last collar was fitted and tested, he put down his pliers and looked at them lying on the workbench in a row of identical bright curves. "Never make more smoke than the heat requires," he said, to no one, to the collars, to the air. He died 3 days later in the cot in the tool shed, with the lantern burning and his tools laid out on the bench beside him, as if he expected to pick them up in the morning. Amos found him at dawn. The cot was neat. The blanket was pulled to his chest. His burned hands were folded on top of it, the scars on his palms catching the early light that came through the shed's single window. Amos sat beside the cot for a long time. He did not cry. He had used up his crying on Clara, and what he felt now was not grief in the way that grief announces itself. It was absence, the sudden physical sensation of a space in the room that would not be filled. Elias had occupied a specific volume of air, a specific weight on the floor, a specific sound, the clink of tools, the scrape of pliers, the dry cough that had become as familiar as the wind. Now that volume was empty, the tools were silent, the cough was gone. Nettie came to the shed door and looked in. She saw Elias. She saw her father sitting beside him. She walked to the workbench and picked up the pliers. Elias's pliers, the ones he had carried in his coat pocket since before she was born, and held them against her chest. "Can I keep these?" she said. Amos nodded. They buried Elias on the slope above the orchard, in a spot where the morning sun hit early, and the cold air drainage flowed past without pooling. It was the warmest piece of ground on the property, and Amos chose it deliberately because Elias had spent his life understanding where heat went and where cold settled, and it seemed right that he should rest where the heat found him first each day. Marin came to the burial. Cade came. Deputy Bell came. Mrs. Garza brought flowers from her kitchen garden, the last of the year, already browning at the edges. 14 people stood on the slope and said nothing, because Elias had been in the valley less than a year, and most of them had not known him well. But all of them had used his pails, his collars, his baffles, and the fire discipline he had taught through Amos to every grower in Adobe Creek. The silence lasted until Nettie, standing at the grave's edge with Elias's pliers in her coat pocket, said, "He taught me to solder." It was enough. It was the only eulogy a tinsmith needed. That evening, Amos sat alone in the tool shed with the lantern burning and Elias's tools laid out on the bench where the old man had left them. The pliers were with Nettie. The rest, the tin snips, the nail punches, the soldering iron, the whetstone, the ball-peen hammer with the cracked handle that Elias had never replaced, because the crack gave it a grip his scarred hands could hold. These remained, arranged in the order Elias had kept them, each tool in its place, each place defined by 30 years of a man's hands reaching for what he needed without looking. Amos touched the soldering iron. It was cold. Everything in the shed was cold, and the absence was not in the temperature, but in the silence where the cough should have been. In the weeks that followed, Amos applied Elias's principles to the system's future. He established thermometer posts painted white for consistent readings. White because Elias had explained that dark surfaces absorb heat and give false readings in sunlight. He built a valley frost roster. 2 watchers per shift, 1 bell captain, 1 fuel wagon. He mapped the cold air drainage after every clear night, marking the paths on a proper surveyor's sheet that Cade provided from the irrigation board's office. He trained 3 of the schoolboys, Wesley Bell, and 2 of Marin's neighbor boys, to read inversion smoke without standing in it. The trick was position. Crouch uphill from the test heap and watch the smoke's behavior from the side, not from below. If the smoke rose and kept rising, the inversion had broken, and the frost danger was passing. If it rose to a certain height and then spread flat, the lid was holding and the cold was still trapped below. If it barely rose at all, If it crawled along the ground like water filling a ditch, the inversion was tight and every pail needed to burn. Marin organized the women into a preparedness network. Every farm within the grid kept wet cloth, water barrels, and sand buckets staged at the pail stations. Every household knew the bell signal. Every mother knew how to seal a room against smoke, wet rags under doors, cloths over windows, children in the innermost room with a bucket of water, and a calm voice telling them to breathe shallow and slow. If this story reminds you why preparation matters, share it with someone who needs to hear it. The spring of 1913 came warm and early, and the warmth was a threat disguised as a gift. Peach blossoms opened in the second week of April, 10 days ahead of the usual schedule. Apple buds swelled and cracked. Pear trees pushed white blooms into air that felt like May. The valley floor was a carpet of color, and growers walked their rows with the nervous pride of men who had survived a war and were now watching their reward materialize in petals and pollen. Amos did not relax. He checked the barometer every morning. He checked the thermometers every evening. He watched the sky the way his mother had watched the sky in Missouri. Not for storms, but for the absence of storms. The clear, still, bottomless blue that meant the earth had no blanket and the heat would leave. On the 20th of April, the barometer dropped. The sky was clear. The wind died at noon. By evening, the temperature on the valley floor had fallen from 53 to 36, and the forecast from Grand Junction mentioned possible frost in low-lying areas. But this frost was different. The cold air drainage pattern had shifted with the season. The lower hollows, where Amos had built his grid, were not the primary danger zone. The threat was on the upper bench, the same north slope where the Haraways had nearly lost their infant, where the temperature had dropped to 17 in January, while the valley floor held at 21. The upper bench had blossomed first because it caught the morning sun. The buds were open, exposed, fragile, and no one had built heaps or placed pails on the bench because Amos's entire system was designed for the low ground. Marin came to his porch at dusk with the temperature readings from her own thermometers and the expression of a woman who had seen a familiar enemy return wearing different clothes. "The bench," she said. "The blossoms opened 3 days ago. If it drops below 28 tonight, they're gone." "I know." "Last time you saved everything by lighting everything." Amos looked at the valley floor, the clay-lined pits, the pail stations, the fire breaks, the system he and Elias had built to protect the low ground where cold pooled. He looked at the upper bench, bare and exposed, where no heaps stood and no pails waited. "Last time I was afraid," Amos said. "Elias taught me not to confuse fear with need." He did not light the whole valley. He did not fill the air with smoke. He chose 12 positions on the upper bench, 12 pockets where the slope flattened and cold air would pause on its way downhill, and he carried pails and straw to each one himself, with Marin, Wesley Bell, and Nettie hauling fuel behind him. He lit them at midnight, when the bench thermometer read 30 degrees and falling. He used less oil, smaller heaps. He lit from the downwind side, the way Elias had taught him. He watched the smoke to trace the air's movement, where it pooled, where it drained, where the cold settled. He did not guess. He read the cold the way Elias had taught him to read it, with his face and his hands, and the behavior of smoke in still air. By 3 in the morning, the bench thermometer read 29, 1 degree above the killing threshold. The pails burned clean. The heaps smoldered low. The smoke was thin enough that a man could see from one end of the bench to the other. The blossoms held. Not all of them. The exposed edges lost petals. 2 trees at the far end of the Haraway parcel, where no pails reached, showed frostburn at the tips. But the center held. The core of the bench orchard, where Amos had placed his 12 positions based on drainage and pooling, came through the night with blossoms intact and buds firm. It was not the dramatic valley-wide battle of January. It was quiet. It was targeted. It was what Elias would have called precision, the right heat in the right place for the right duration, and not a breath of smoke more. Ruth Haraway stood on her porch at dawn and looked at her apple trees. The blossoms were covered in a thin film of soot, just enough to show that the pails had been there, but they were open and alive. She looked down the slope at Amos, who was collecting empty pails in the gray light with Nettie beside him, carrying the slate. Ruth did not shout thanks. She did not wave. She went inside and came back with a loaf of bread and a jar of preserves and walked them down the slope and set them on Amos's porch without a word. Then she went home. Nettie wrote on the slate, Bench 29, blossoms held, 12 pails, 6 heaps. She underlined the numbers twice. Voss had been quiet since January. He had not apologized, not acknowledged the method, not offered pails or fuel or assistance. He had sold goods to the growers who came to his store, taken their money, nodded when they talked about Amos's system, and said nothing. The silence was not peace. It was planning. On the 18th of April, 2 days before the spring frost, Voss had bought every barrel of coal oil available from the freight depot at Grand Junction, 42 barrels. He stored them in his warehouse behind the store and told no one. When the frost warning came on the 20th, 3 growers went to Voss's store to buy fuel for their pails. Voss quoted them a price of $4 per barrel, double the usual rate. When they protested, he shrugged. Supply and demand, he said. I bought what was available. If you wanted cheaper oil, you should have bought it in March. The growers paid. They had no choice. The alternative was losing their blossoms, and no amount of principle could replace a season's fruit. Nettie found out because the bellboy told her at school. Wesley had overheard his mother talking to Deputy Bell about the oil prices, and Inez had used a word that Nettie did not repeat, but understood. That evening, Nettie asked to see Voss's account at the store. Amos kept a ledger of his purchases, every grower did, and the ledger showed that Voss had sold him oil at $2 per barrel in December. Nettie flipped through the pages and counted. Voss had not ordered unusual quantities of oil from the depot until after the January crisis. After the crisis, his orders tripled. By March, he had accumulated enough oil to supply the entire valley, and enough leverage to name his price when the cold returned. She showed Amos the numbers. She did not say what they meant. She did not need to. He is selling fear, Amos said. Nettie looked at him with her mother's eyes, Clara's eyes, clear and unsentimental and accustomed to seeing things as they were. He is selling oil, she said. The fear is free. Amos stood on his porch and looked at the valley, the orchards coming into bloom, the pale stations waiting at their positions, the clay-lined pits along the ditches, the fire breaks scraped clean and ready. The system worked. The method was proven. The knowledge was spreading from farm to farm, taught by Amos and Marin and, increasingly, by growers who had learned the basics and adapted them to their own land. But fuel, by Croquipa, fuel was still a choke point, and Voss had his hand around the throat. The question was not whether the valley could survive another frost. The question was whether the valley could survive the man who had decided to profit from the fear of frost. And the answer to that question would not come in a single night. The Frost Cooperative formed in the spring of 1914, and it formed the way most useful things form in small communities, not through a vote or a charter or a formal declaration, but through the slow accumulation of people doing the same thing at the same time and deciding they might as well do it together. Cade drafted the agreement. He sat at Amos's kitchen table with a pen and a sheet of irrigation board stationery and wrote out the terms in the plain, undecorated language of a man who had spent 40 years writing water contracts. Every farm within the grid contributed pails, fuel, labor, and thermometer readings. Every farm maintained its own stations, heaps, or pits, pails with collars, fire breaks, wet burlap, sand buckets. Every farm sent one person to the night watch when the bell captain called a frost warning, and every farm recorded its temperature readings on a standard form that Nettie designed, with columns for time, station, temperature, wind, and sky condition. The form was Nettie's idea, and it was better than anything Amos or Cade could have produced. She had spent a year recording numbers on a school slate, and she understood what mattered and what did not. She left off the columns that other forms would have included: humidity, barometric pressure, cloud type, because the growers who would fill them out were not scientists and did not own the instruments to measure those things. She kept the columns that told the story. Where was the cold? How cold was it? And was the sky open or closed? 3 questions, 3 columns. A child could fill it out by lantern light at 2 in the morning, and the next day the numbers could be compared across every farm in the valley. Cade took the forms to the irrigation board and had them printed on proper cardstock. He paid for the printing himself, which was the closest thing to an apology he ever offered for the weeks he had spent telling Amos the plan was impossible. The cooperative's first full season ran through the winter of 1914 into 15. 23 farms participated. Each farm maintained an average of 8 pail stations and 12 heat positions. The total system covered roughly 400 acres of the valley floor and lower slopes. Not the entire valley, but the core where cold air drainage pooled and where the majority of the fruit grew. On clear nights when the barometer dropped and the wind died, the bell captain, or ray, a rotating position that Amos insisted on because no single person should carry the weight every time, rang the signal from the church steps. Watchers went to their stations. Thermometers were read, and if the temperature crossed the threshold, the pails were lit, the heaps were fired, and the valley floor held its warmth against the open sky. It was not dramatic every time. Most frost nights were mild, a drop to 30, a few hours of low burning, a dawn check that showed buds firm and bark whole. The system earned its keep not through spectacular battles, but through the steady, unremarkable accumulation of nights where the margin held and the fruit survived. But the system's success created a new problem, and the new problem had a name. Voss had not been idle. Through the summer and fall of 1914, he had continued buying fuel, coal oil, kerosene, and the cheaper grades of petroleum waste that the railroad sold by the barrel. He stored it in his warehouse behind the store, in barrels stacked 3 high along the back wall. By November, he held an estimated 60 barrels, enough to supply the entire cooperative for 2 full frost seasons and enough leverage to set whatever price the market would bear when the cold returned. He was not stupid. He understood the cooperative's weakness. The method worked. The placement was sound. The fire discipline held. But every pail needed oil, and oil came from the freight depot, and the freight depot sold to whoever arrived with cash first. Voss arrived first every time because Voss had cash and Voss had a wagon at the depot on delivery day, and Voss understood that controlling the fuel meant controlling the valley's survival without needing to control the method. He raised the price again in December, $4.50 per barrel, more than double the rate Amos had paid the year before. 3 farms dropped out of the cooperative because they could not afford the fuel. 2 others cut their pail stations in half. The grid developed holes, farms that went dark on frost nights because the oil cost more than the fruit was worth. The damage showed on the coldest night of December when a moderate frost dropped the valley floor to 27, and the grid, which should have held every acre above 30, lost 2 orchards at the edges where farms had gone dark. Hendricks, the grower with 40 acres on the south slope, burned through his half ration of oil by 1 in the morning and watched the rest of the night with empty pails and a temperature that slid to 25 before dawn. He lost a quarter of his young pear trees. The bark split in the silence, not with the sound of breaking, with no sound at all. He found the damage at first light, running his thumb along fissures in the wood that had not been there the night before. Hendricks went to Voss's store the next morning and bought 4 more barrels at $4.50 each. He paid in cash he had set aside for his daughter's school tuition in Grand Junction. He did not look at Voss when he paid. Voss did not look at him when he made change. Amos went to Voss's store in January of 1915 and stood at the counter and asked him directly to lower the price. "You are killing the cooperative," Amos said. "I am selling oil at a fair price," Voss said. "Supply and demand. If the cooperative wants cheaper fuel, the cooperative should buy in advance." "The cooperative cannot buy in advance because you buy the supply before it reaches the depot." Voss smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. It was the smile of a man who had found the lever and intended to pull it until something broke. "Then the cooperative should find another supplier," Voss said. Amos left. He walked home through the lower orchard, past the pail stations and the clay-lined pits, and the fire breaks scraped clean for winter. He walked past Elias's grave on the slope, where the wooden marker had weathered to gray, and the morning sun was just reaching the grass. He did not have another supplier. There was no other supplier within freight distance, and Voss knew it. The fire started on the 3rd of February, 1915, at approximately 10 in the evening, in Voss's warehouse behind the store. The cause was simple and stupid, and exactly the kind of thing that Elias had spent his life warning against. Voss had installed a small cast-iron stove in the warehouse to keep the pipes from freezing. The stove sat 6 feet from the nearest barrel of oil. The recommended clearance for a stove near combustible liquid, according to every fire safety standard that existed in 1915, was at least 15 feet. 6 was less than half of that. Voss knew the clearance. He had heard Amos and Elias lecture about fire discipline at the cooperative meetings. He had dismissed the lectures the way he dismissed everything that came from men he considered beneath him, with a smile and a turned shoulder. The stove's firebox door was improperly latched. A coal rolled out at some point in the evening and came to rest against a pile of oil-soaked rags that Voss had left beside the stove after filling a customer's lantern. The rags caught. The flame found the nearest barrel. The barrel's bung was loose. The warehouse did not explode. Oil fires do not explode the way dynamite does. They bloom. The flame found the oil, and the oil found the air, and the warehouse filled with a heat so intense that the tin roof warped and the window glass ran liquid before it shattered. Amos heard the shout from his porch 300 yards away. He saw the orange glow above the store roofline, and he ran. Not because he cared about Voss's warehouse, because the warehouse shared a wall with the feed shed, and the feed shed shared a wall with the livery, and the livery was 30 feet from the church, and if the fire jumped, half the town would burn. He organized the bucket line in the time it took other men to find their boots. Marin was beside him. Wesley Bell was beside her. Deputy Bell arrived in his nightshirt with a badge pinned to his coat. 14 people formed a chain from the irrigation ditch to the feed shed wall and passed water in whatever they could carry: buckets, pots, wash basins, a soup tureen that Mrs. Garza had grabbed from her kitchen shelf. The heat from the warehouse pushed them back. It came in waves, each one hotter than the last, as new barrels caught, and the oil found air through widening gaps in the walls. Amos felt the heat on his face from 30 feet away. The same heat he had spent 2 years learning to control in pails and pits, now loose and wild and answering to nothing. Elias's voice in his head: a proud fire becomes a funeral. The bucket line worked the way the frost grid worked, station by station, each person responsible for the next, water moving from the ditch to the wall in a chain of hands that did not stop because stopping meant the fire jumped, and the feed shed caught, and the livery caught, and then the church, and then there would be no stone walls and no 29-degree refuge, and no bell to ring on frost nights. Nettie ran water from the pump to the line's midpoint because the ditch was freezing at the edges, and the buckets were coming up with ice crusts that had to be cracked before the water could be thrown. She was 19 years old and she moved with the focused, efficient calm of a woman who had been recording emergencies on a school slate since she was 12 and had learned that panic does not improve numbers. They saved the feed shed. They saved the livery. They saved the church. They could not save the warehouse. The 60 barrels of hoarded oil burned for 3 hours. The column of black smoke rose straight up through the inversion layer and broke through it, climbing into the night sky in a pillar that could be seen from the bench road and the upper slopes, and people said later from the outskirts of Grand Junction. It was the tallest, thickest column of smoke the valley had ever produced, and it was not fighting frost, it was burning profit. Amos stood at the edge of the fire line and watched the warehouse collapse. The roof folded inward. The walls sagged. The barrels burst one by one, with sounds like large men coughing, and each burst sent a new wave of heat across the yard that pushed the bucket line back 3 steps. There was a moment. Amos felt it. Marin felt it. Everyone on the line felt it, when the fire reached the back wall and threatened the store itself. Amos looked at the store, Voss's store, the counter where Voss had told him to bring a deed, the platform where Voss had laughed and said he meant to save peaches by poisoning children, the ledger where Voss had tracked the notes of every struggling farmer in the valley. Amos turned to the bucket line. "Wet the store wall," he said. They wet the store wall. They saved Voss's store. At 3 a.m, when the warehouse was ash and embers and the 60 barrels were gone, Voss stood in the yard in his nightclothes and looked at the ruin. His face was not angry. It was empty. The face of a man who has watched the instrument of his power destroy itself through the same carelessness he attributed to others. Amos walked past him. He did not stop. He did not gloat. He was carrying an empty bucket back to the ditch, and his arms were tired, and there was nothing to say that the fire had not already said, but Voss spoke. "I thought fear was a crop," he said. His voice was hoarse from smoke. "Something I could grow and harvest." Amos stopped. He turned. He looked at Voss standing in the light of his own burned warehouse, soot on his vest, ash in his hair, the smell of 60 barrels of wasted oil hanging over both of them like a verdict. "It is," Amos said, "but it poisons the soil." He walked home. The bucket swung empty in his hand. The stars were visible again above the smoke, sharp and cold and indifferent, and the barometer on his kitchen wall, when he checked it, read steady. Voss did not leave the valley. He rebuilt the warehouse with proper clearances and sold oil at the depot price, which was $2 a barrel. He never joined the cooperative. He never acknowledged that his hoarding had weakened the grid or that his carelessness had nearly burned the town. But he stopped buying oil in advance, and he stopped raising prices during frost warnings, and the smile he wore when Amos entered his store became something smaller and tighter, the expression of a man who has lost a contest he will not name. It was not redemption. It was diminishment. And in a valley where everyone knew the story of the warehouse fire and everyone understood why it had started, diminishment was enough. Amos and Marin married in the spring of 1916 in the stone church that had held 29 degrees on the night of the first crisis, while the rest of the valley shivered. The courtship, if it could be called that, had happened entirely through work. They had walked frost lines together at 2 a.m, checking thermometers, adjusting pails, arguing about whether to light the bench stations or hold fuel for the lower hollows. They had repaired pails side by side on Amos's porch, Marin cutting tin while Amos bent baffles, their hands moving in a rhythm that developed over months of shared labor until each knew what the other would reach for before the reaching happened. They had taught children together at the cooperative meetings, Amos showing the men and boys how to read cold air drainage, Marin showing the women and girls how to seal a house against smoke, and when to extinguish a heap that was burning too dirty. The first moment that was not about work happened on a November evening in 1915, after a long day of repositioning pail stations along the south ditch. They sat on Amos's porch, drinking coffee that was more water than coffee. Supplies had been lean since Voss's price hike, and Marin said, without looking at him, "My house is colder than yours." "Your house faces north," Amos said. "That is not why I'm telling you." Amos looked at her. She looked at her coffee. The moment lasted long enough for Nettie, watching from the kitchen window, to write on her slate, "Finally." The proposal, when it came 4 months later, was not romantic in the way stories make proposals romantic. They were standing at the edge of Marin's apple orchard on a March evening, looking at buds that were tight and firm and 3 weeks from opening, and Amos said, "I think we should combine the orchards." Marin looked at him. Her expression was the same expression she had worn the first time she saw his flour sack map, skeptical, interested, unwilling to commit without evidence. "Combine the orchards," she said. "And the households. And the households. If you are willing." Marin looked at the orchard. She looked at Amos. She looked at the pail stations along the ditch line, each one fitted with a tin collar that Nettie had soldered. "I still think half of what you do is foolish," she said. "But the other half has kept my trees alive for 3 years, and I would rather be married to a man whose foolishness has a system than to a man whose good sense has nothing." It was the most romantic thing either of them had ever said, and it was enough. Nettie signed the witness book at the church. Her fingers carried the small, silvery scars of solder burns, marks she had earned at Elias's workbench and wore without embarrassment, the way a carpenter wears calluses. She signed in the careful, upright hand she used for the cooperative's temperature records, and beneath her name she wrote, "Weather clear, barometer steady, no frost expected." It was the only weather report ever entered in a wedding register in Adobe Creek Valley, and the minister did not ask her to remove it. The years after the marriage compress the way years do when the crisis has passed and the work becomes the story. Amos and Marin raised fruit, peach, apple, and pear on 52 combined acres that straddled the lower slope and the first bench. They raised children, a son born in 17, a daughter in 19, in a house that Amos expanded with lumber from the same collapsed barn that had provided straw for the first heaps. They raised a generation of growers who thought of frost not as an act of God, but as a condition of air, measurable, predictable, and manageable if you understood where the cold went and what it cost to hold it back. The cooperative's rhythm became the valley's rhythm. On clear nights in December and January, when the barometer fell and the wind died, the bell captain walked to the church steps and read the thermometer. If the reading dropped below 32 and the sky was open, the bell rang once. Watchers went to their stations. They checked pails, checked fuel, checked fire breaks. They waited. If the temperature crossed 28 and kept falling, the bell rang 3 times, and the valley lit its fires, not in panic, not in chaos, but in the orderly station-by-station sequence that Amos had drawn on a flour sack, and Elias had refined with his pliers, and Marin had taught to every household within the grid. A typical frost night now looked nothing like the first crisis. There was no choking smoke. There were no flaring heaps. The clay-lined pits burned cleaner than the old straw mounds. The collared pails held steady flames that a man could sit beside without coughing. The wet burlap stayed on its posts. The sand buckets stayed full. And the temperature on the valley floor held its margin, 4 degrees, 6 degrees, sometimes 9, while the exposed bench dropped below the line that killed buds and cracked bark. The cooperative grew. By 1920, 31 farms participated. Each farm maintained its stations. Each farm contributed readings to the record that Cade kept in the Irrigation Board office. a leather-bound ledger that eventually contained 8 years of temperature data from every clear night in the valley, organized by station, date, and sky condition. The ledger became the valley's institutional memory, a map of cold air behavior that told any new grower exactly where to place pails and exactly when to light them. Cade became the cooperative's record keeper, a role that suited his temperament better than any he had held before. He was precise, thorough, and he understood that numbers outlasted opinions. He died in 1922 at his desk, with the ledger open to the current season's readings. The irrigation board continued the records in his name. Deputy Bell refused future nuisance complaints against the cooperative unless specific safety rules were broken. He posted the rules, Elias's rules, written in Amos's hand, printed on the same cardstock as Nettie's temperature forms, at the church door, the store, and the schoolhouse. The rules were simple: clearances maintained, fire breaks scraped, burlap staged, sand ready, no lighting into the wind, and no more smoke than the heat required. Nettie designed a cleaner draft collar based on Elias's original sketches and her own improvements, a double-walled collar with an air gap that insulated the outer surface and reduced the scorching that warped single-wall collars after repeated use. She built the prototype with Elias's pliers, which she kept in her coat pocket the way he had kept them, and she tested it through 3 frost seasons before declaring it ready for the cooperative. The design spread to neighboring valleys, carried by growers who visited Adobe Creek and went home with a collar and a set of temperature forms and the advice to walk their land at dawn and feel the cold at their ankles. Safer heaters replaced the worst heaps as money improved. By the early 20s, several farms used commercial stack heaters purchased from a supplier in Grand Junction who had, ironically, been inspired by the same crude methods that W.C. Shue had developed in the same region a decade before Amos arrived. The heaters burned cleaner than straw. They lasted longer than lard pails, but the principle remained identical. Heat placed where the cold settles, not where the ground is flat or the walking is easy. Amos watched the cleaner heaters arrive and felt something he could not easily name, a satisfaction that the method was improving, laced with a loyalty to the ugly, improvised tools that had saved his orchard when improvement was not an option. He kept 4 of the original lard pails on a shelf in the tool shed, their tins scorched black, their baffles bent from Elias's pliers, their wicks long since burned away. He kept them the way a man keeps the first tool he owned, not because it was the best tool, but because it was the tool that taught him what tools could do. Amos lived out his later years in the same valley, in the house with the soot stain still visible under the porch eave, where the smoke from the first crisis had settled into the grain of the wood and refused to leave. He developed a cough in his 50s, not tuberculosis, not the killing cough that had taken Clara, but the dry, persistent rasp of a man who had spent too many nights breathing smoke and oil fumes in the service of keeping things alive. Marin made him wear a cloth over his face during frost nights, and he wore it, and he still coughed. He taught until his body would not let him teach. On October mornings, when the aspens went gold and the first hint of winter sharpened the air, he walked new cooperative members through the ditch lines the way Elias had walked him, crouching low, feeling the cold at ankle height, showing them where the air pooled and where it drained. He taught them to read smoke. He taught them to punch draft holes by testing rather than measuring. He taught them that a frost fire must be obedient, and he said it the same way Elias had said it, with the weight of a man who has seen what happens when fire obeys nothing but itself. His last frost night was in January of 1929. He was 54. The cough had settled into his chest in a way that made Marin check the barometer with 2 kinds of worry, one for the orchard and one for her husband. He lit 3 pails along the lower ditch and checked the thermometers at midnight, and at 2 and at 4. By dawn, his hands were shaking too badly to hold the pencil, and Nettie, 28 years old by then, married to a grower from the next valley, visiting for the frost season, recorded the final readings for him. He never called the first night a miracle. When visitors came, and they came, growers from other valleys, agricultural agents, a man from the state university who was writing a monograph on frost protection, Amos told them the same thing every time. It was a margin, he said. 9 degrees, not a salvation. A margin. The visitors wrote down the number. They drew diagrams. They asked about the smoke, and Amos told them what Marin had told him on his porch in 1913. Smoke is not the horse, it is the tracks. The visitors looked confused, and Amos explained, and they wrote that down too, and some of them understood it, and some of them did not, and the ones who did not went home and lit straw piles on hilltops where the coal did not pool, and the straw burned to ash, and the frost took their orchards, and they blamed the method instead of the placement. Marin kept Elias's pliers in the kitchen drawer beside the bread knife and the can opener, because she believed that useful tools belonged where they could be reached, not where they could be admired. When the children asked about the pliers, why they were scarred, why the grips were wrapped in wire, why one jaw was slightly bent, Marin told them about the man who had carried them in his coat pocket and taught their sister to solder and died in a tool shed with his work finished. Nettie kept the flour paper map, the original, drawn in carpenter's pencil on the back of a flour sack, pressed between the pages of the cooperative's first account book. The map was stained with oil and sweat, and the faint brown mark of Amos's blood from the night his burn opened during the crisis. The pencil lines had faded. The ignition order was barely legible, but the map remained what it had always been, not a plan for fighting frost, but a record of a man deciding to fight instead of surrender, drawn on the only paper he had. On clear January nights, the valley still goes silent before frost. The stars come out sharp and hard, and the air stops moving, and the barometer needle drops the way it dropped in 1913, slowly, steadily, promising nothing and threatening everything. Lyman Voss once stood on the freight platform and said, "He means to save peaches by poisoning children." The line was clever and carried just enough truth to make people uncomfortable. It traveled through the valley in a single afternoon. It was repeated at the church, at the school, and at 3 farms on the lower road. It was the kind of line that sticks. But here's what stuck longer. Here's what the valley kept after the line was forgotten, and Voss's warehouse was ash, and Voss's smile had tightened into something that no longer convinced anyone of anything. On clear January nights, when the barometer drops and the wind dies and the cold begins to settle into the low places where the ditches run, a lantern appears at the church steps, then another near the lower ditch, then another among the orchard rows. Not a town choking in fear, not a valley filled with blind smoke and desperate fire, but men and women and children who had been taught by a stove repairman and a tinsmith and a Norwegian widow to read the cold before it could take them, walking to their stations, checking their thermometers, lighting their pails with the wind at their backs, and the smoke telling them where the heat was going. The children who coughed through wet cloths on the night of the first crisis stand as grown men and women beside thermometer posts painted white. They teach their own sons and daughters when to light, when to wait, and when smoke means waste instead of wisdom. And Amos Whitcomb's name lives not in a monument or a plaque or a line in a history book, but in the quiet, practiced movements of people who walk their land at dawn, crouch low, and feel the cold where it settles, because a man once taught them that heat leaves, and that knowing where it goes is the first step toward holding it back.